When Grace Miller opened a locked basement door during a billionaire's birthday party, she didn't scream. She froze. Because the woman she found wasn't missing. She was hidden. What looked like a perfect celebration upstairs was built on silence, fear, and betrayal below. One decision that night pulled apart a powerful family's darkest secret. But what came out after that door opened destroyed a billionaire forever. And you won't believe who put her there or why. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The Hawthorne estate looked like a monument to success that night. Glass walls glowed against the California hillside, reflecting strings of warm lights wrapped around sculpted palms. Luxury cars lined the long private drive, black sedans, imported sports cars, tinted windows hiding faces that ruled boardrooms and headlines. From the outside, it was flawless, controlled, untouchable. Inside, the celebration was already in full motion. Crystal chandeliers spilled soft gold light across polished marble floors. A live jazz band played near the open terrace, their music smooth and expensive, drifting easily between conversations. Servers moved with quiet precision, offering champagne, rare whiskey, delicate plates that looked too perfect to eat. Tonight was Ethan Hawthorne's birthday, a billionaire before 40, tech empire founder, media darling, a man whose name carried weight in every room he entered. Ethan stood near the center of the grand living hall, dressed in a tailored black suit, collar open, no tie. Confidence sat on him naturally. He smiled as guests approached, shook hands, accepted praise like it was routine currency. Every gesture was calm, rehearsed, controlled. To anyone watching, Ethan Hawthorne had everything. Yet something was missing. People noticed it in fragments. A pause in conversation, a glance toward the staircase, a question asked too casually. "Is your mother joining us tonight?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "She's resting," he said smoothly. "Long day, doctor's orders." The explanation floated easily, believable enough to settle curiosity. Most guests nodded and moved on. After all, Margaret Hawthorne was elderly, 72. Frail, some whispered. It made sense that she wouldn't endure the noise of a party like this. But the absence lingered. Margaret Hawthorne wasn't just Ethan's mother. She was the woman who built the foundation of everything he stood on. Before the billions, before the power, before the headlines, there had been Margaret, a sharp-minded, disciplined woman who had raised Ethan alone after his father's death, guiding him through college, early investments, his first company. She had once been seen at his side at every public milestone. Until recently. Now, her place beside him was occupied by Vanessa Cole. Vanessa wore a deep red evening dress, sleek and deliberate. Her blonde hair fell perfectly over her shoulders, makeup flawless, posture confident. She stood close to Ethan, close enough that her hand brushed his arm when she laughed, close enough to look intentional. To outsiders, she looked like a partner, maybe more. Whispers moved quietly through the room. "She's always here now. I haven't seen his mother in months." Vanessa accepted compliments as if they belonged to her. When someone praised the party, she smiled and thanked them without correcting the assumption that she had helped host it. Ethan didn't stop her. The night continued, polished and loud. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose and fell. Toasts were made to innovation, to dominance, to the future. Ethan raised his glass and spoke about vision, discipline, and loyalty. Applause followed, warm and enthusiastic. Above it all, the house felt alive. But below, far beneath the music, beneath the marble and light, the basement remained untouched by celebration. The air down there was cold, heavy with damp concrete and dust. A single yellow bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering faintly, casting stretched shadows across stacked boxes and covered furniture. Margaret Hawthorne sat on the floor, her back pressed against the wall, her legs pulled in close, arms wrapped tightly around herself for warmth. The thin cardigan she wore did little to stop the cold seeping through her bones. She listened. Music vibrated faintly through the structure of the house. Not clear, not joyful, just distorted enough to remind her that life was happening directly above her. Without her, Margaret lifted her head slowly toward the metal door across the room. No handle on her side, just smooth steel and a thick lock bolted from the outside. She had tried it already, again and again, pushing, pulling, knocking until her knuckles burned. No response. Her phone was gone, her purse gone. Everything that connected her to the world beyond this room had been taken before the door closed. Her breathing grew shallow as she leaned her forehead against the wall, steadying herself. She had always been strong, disciplined, unyielding, but the cold made her hands shake. Minutes passed strangely in the basement, stretching longer than they should have. Margaret focused on the hum of the bulb, the distant thump of bass from above, the rhythm of her own heartbeat. A sharp ache pulsed in her chest. She shifted slowly, careful not to lose balance. Her age made every movement deliberate now. This wasn't a misunderstanding. She knew that. Her thoughts drifted back to earlier that evening. The house had been busy then. Staff preparing, flowers being arranged, lights tested. Margaret had been in the study upstairs, watching through the glass as the sun dipped below the hills. She had felt it before she understood it. Something was wrong. It had started with a dress. Not hers. A red one, hanging near the entrance, carefully protected in plastic. She had asked a staff member who it belonged to. The answer had been hesitant, vague. Later, she confronted Ethan. He hadn't looked surprised, just annoyed. He told her Vanessa would be attending. Publicly, he said it was strategic, that appearances mattered, that Margaret's presence complicated things. Margaret had reminded him who she was, what she had sacrificed, what she still represented. Ethan's expression hardened. He said she was emotional, unstable, that she embarrassed him without realizing it, that tonight wasn't about her. Then he took her arm, firm, controlled, not violent, worse, calculated. He guided her down the back hallway, away from the light, away from the staff. She protested, told him to stop, told him she would stay upstairs, remain quiet, anything. He didn't listen. The door opened. The push was brief. The lock was final. Now, sitting alone in the cold, Margaret felt the weight of that betrayal settle fully into her chest. Above her, Ethan laughed. Vanessa smiled. The party continued, perfect, glittering, uninterrupted. Margaret closed her eyes, pressing her palm flat against the floor to anchor herself. She didn't know how long she would be left there. She didn't know if anyone would come. But somewhere deep inside her, beneath the fear and exhaustion, something else remained. Quiet, unbroken, waiting. And unseen by everyone upstairs, the truth waited with her. Time lost its meaning in the basement. Margaret Hawthorne couldn't tell whether minutes or hours had passed. The cold seeped deeper into her joints, settling in places age had already weakened. She shifted again, wincing softly, pressing her back harder against the wall as if it might somehow offer warmth. Above her, the party refused to end. Laughter drifted down in muffled waves. Music changed tempo, faster now, more confident. Applause erupted at one point, sharp and sudden, making Margaret flinch despite herself. Ethan must have been giving another speech. The thought tightened something in her chest. She pressed her lips together and forced herself to breathe slowly. Panic would only make this worse. She had survived harder things than this: widowhood, debt, years of being underestimated. She had raised a son alone and built discipline into every corner of his life. And yet, here she was, locked away like an inconvenience. Her fingers brushed the concrete beside her, grounding herself in the present. The surface was rough, unforgiving. She imagined the estate above her in perfect detail, The open spaces, the glass walls, the warmth. The cruelty of it wasn't just the confinement. It was the contrast. A faint dizziness washed over her. She closed her eyes until it passed, counting her breaths the way doctors had taught her years ago. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slowly, somewhere nearby, pipes groaned softly, the house settling, or ignoring her. Margaret pushed herself carefully into a sitting position again and lifted her head toward the door. "Ethan," she called. Her voice echoed back thin and fragile, stripped of authority. She tried again, louder this time, striking the metal with the side of her fist. The sound rang sharply once, twice, then faded. No footsteps answered. She rested her forehead against the door, feeling the cold seep into her skin. The lock on the other side might as well have been a wall. Above, a new wave of laughter rose. Margaret's eyes burned, but she refused to cry. Tears felt like surrender, and she had never surrendered in her life. On the lower level of the estate, far from the guests and music, Grace Miller pushed a cleaning cart down the hallway. She moved quietly by habit. The staff had learned long ago that discretion was valued more than speed in a house like this. Grace kept her head down, her gray uniform neat beneath a white apron, sneakers barely making a sound against the stone floor. She had been assigned to the storage corridors and wine cellar that night, areas that rarely saw guests. It was colder down here, quieter. The kind of quiet that usually felt like relief. Tonight it didn't. Grace slowed her steps. First she thought it was nothing. Pipe shifting, air moving through the vents. The Hawthorne estate was old beneath its modern shell. Then she heard it again. Not loud, not clear. A sound that didn't belong. Grace stopped completely, her hand tightening around the cart handle. She tilted her head, listening past the distant thrum of music above. There it was. Faint knock. Uneven. Weak. Her heartbeat quickened. She glanced down the hallway, half expecting another staff member to appear and explain it away. No one did. The sound came again, closer this time. From the basement door. Grace swallowed. The basement was off-limits during events. Everyone knew that. It was locked and used. Forgotten. No one should have been down there. She pushed the cart a little closer, her movements slow, cautious. The metal door came into view, dark and solid, exactly as it always was. Except now, she heard a voice, barely more than a whisper. "Please." Grace's breath caught. This wasn't a guest who had wandered somewhere they shouldn't. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Her first instinct was to step back, to pretend she hadn't heard anything. The Hawthorns were powerful. Mistakes here didn't just cost jobs, they followed people. Silence was safer. Silence was expected. But the voice came again, strained and trembling. Grace felt something twist sharply in her chest. She thought of Margaret Hawthorne. Grace hadn't seen her all evening. That alone was strange. Margaret always acknowledged staff. Always smiled, always asked names, always remembered them. Just a few days ago, Margaret had stopped Grace in the hallway to ask if she was eating enough during long shifts. The memory hit hard. Grace stepped closer to the door and pressed her ear gently against the metal. There was no doubt now. Someone was trapped inside. Her hands began to shake. She reached for the handle, already knowing it wouldn't turn. Didn't. The lock held firm. This wasn't an accident. Grace backed away, her thoughts racing. She could report it. She could find a supervisor. She could walk away and let someone else decide. But every option felt like a delay, and delay felt dangerous. The voice behind the door had gone quiet now. That scared her more than the knocking. Grace turned sharply and hurried down the corridor toward a small supply closet. Her pulse roared in her ears as she unlocked it and reached inside. The spare keys hung exactly where they always did. She stared at them for a long second. Using them without permission would mean consequences. Severe ones. She imagined Ethan Hawthorne's face when he found out. the calm anger, the power behind it. Then she imagined the voice behind the door falling completely silent. Grace grabbed the keys. Her steps were faster now as she returned to the basement door, heart pounding hard enough to hurt. She checked the hallway once more, empty. With trembling hands, she fitted the key into the lock. She hesitated. Once she turned it, there would be no going back. Grace inhaled sharply and twisted the key. The lock clicked. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet corridor, impossibly final. Grace pushed the door open. Cold air rushed out, carrying the smell of concrete and dust. The single bulb inside flickered, casting pale light across the room. At first, she saw only shadows. Then she saw Margaret Hawthorne. She was on the floor near the far wall, curled inward, arms wrapped around herself. Her face was pale, lips dry, eyes half closed. Grace dropped the keys and rushed forward, kneeling beside her. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Mrs. Hawthorne." Margaret's eyelids fluttered. Her gaze shifted slowly, unfocused at first, then locking onto Grace's face. Relief flooded her expression. Quiet, exhausted, unmistakable. "Grace," Margaret murmured. Grace swallowed hard, fighting the panic rising in her throat. She carefully placed her jacket around Margaret's shoulders, rubbing her arms to bring warmth. "You're not alone," Grace said softly. "I'm here. I'm going to get help. I promise." Margaret's fingers tightened weakly around Grace's sleeve. Above them, the music played on. But the silence that had hidden everything was finally broken. Grace didn't leave Margaret's side immediately. She stayed kneeling on the cold concrete, one arm wrapped protectively around the older woman's shoulders, the other resting lightly against her back. Margaret's body felt frighteningly cold through the thin fabric of her clothes. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, like each breath required conscious effort. Grace forced herself to stay calm. Panic would only slow her down. "I'm calling for help," Grace said again, slower this time, making sure Margaret heard her. "Emergency services. They'll come right away." Margaret nodded faintly, her eyes drifting closed for a moment too long. Grace gently squeezed her arm. "Stay with me," she said. "Please." Grace pulled her phone from her pocket. Her hands were shaking badly now, but she steadied them against her knee before unlocking the screen. She dialed 911. The call connected quickly. "This is an emergency," Grace said, her voice trembling but clear. "My name is Grace Miller. I'm calling from the Hawthorne estate in Los Angeles County. There's an elderly woman locked in the basement. She's been trapped for hours and needs medical help immediately." The operator told her to slow down, asked for the address, asked for details. Grace answered everything. She explained that the woman was 72 years old, weak, cold, barely responsive. She explained that the basement door had been locked from the outside. She did not soften her words. "Yes," Grace said firmly when asked if the woman had been confined against her will. "She was locked in." There was a brief pause on the line. Then the operator's tone changed. "Stay with her," the operator said. "Help is on the way. Paramedics and police are being dispatched now. Do not leave her alone." Grace exhaled shakily, relief washing through her so strongly her vision blurred. "I won't," she said. "I'm right here." She ended the call and set the phone down beside her, immediately turning her attention back to Margaret. She gently adjusted the jacket around her shoulders, rubbing her arms in slow, careful motions. "They're coming," Grace said softly. "You're going to be okay." Margaret's lips moved. Her voice came out thin but steady. "He locked me in," she whispered. Grace's jaw tightened. "I know," she said. "You're safe now." Margaret's eyes glistened. She didn't cry. She just stared at the wall for a long moment, absorbing the truth of what had happened. Above them, the party roared on. Grace could hear the music clearly now. The bass vibrated faintly through the floor. Laughter followed. Applause. The contrast made her stomach turn. She stayed close, talking to Margaret in a low, calm voice about anything that might keep her alert. The weather, the quiet downstairs halls. Small, ordinary things that felt almost absurd given the situation. Margaret listened, nodding occasionally. Her grip on Grace's sleeve loosened slightly as her breathing steadied. Minutes passed. Then more. Grace checked her phone again, counting the seconds since the call. It felt like time was stretching, bending under the weight of anticipation. Then she heard it. At first, it blended with the music, a distant hum, low and constant. Grace held her breath and listened harder. There it was again. Sirens. Her heart jumped. "They're coming," she said, her voice breaking with relief. "Can you hear that?" Margaret's eyes opened wider. She nodded weakly. The sirens grew louder with each passing moment, cutting through the night air beyond the estate. Grace imagined flashing lights approaching the long private drive, security gates opening, the illusion of control beginning to crack. Upstairs, something changed. The music faltered. Grace could hear the subtle shift even from below, the hesitation, the confusion. Voices rose in uncertain tones. Footsteps moved quickly across the floor above. The sirens were impossible to ignore now. Grace stayed where she was, her body angled protectively toward Margaret, as if she could shield her from whatever came next. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the basement. Voices urgent, professional. "Down here," Grace called out. "Basement." Moments later, 2 paramedics rushed in, followed by uniformed police officers. The bright beam of a flashlight swept across the room, illuminating Margaret fully for the first time. The paramedics moved fast but carefully, kneeling beside Margaret, checking her vitals, asking gentle questions. Margaret answered weakly but clearly enough. "She's hypothermic," one of them said quietly. "Dehydrated." They worked with practiced efficiency, wrapping Margaret in thermal blankets, supporting her as they carefully lifted her onto a stretcher. Grace stood back slightly, her hands trembling now that the urgency had shifted. One of the officers approached her. "Did you find her?" he asked. "Yes," Grace said. "She was locked in here." The officer's expression hardened. He nodded and turned to examine the door, the lock, the lack of an interior handle. "This was deliberate," he said quietly to his partner. As the stretcher was rolled out of the basement, Grace followed close behind. Margaret's eyes found hers again, holding on. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. Grace swallowed hard. "You don't have to thank me." They reached the main level. The moment the stretcher emerged into the grand living hall, everything stopped. Music cut off mid-note. Conversations died instantly. Dozens of faces turned at once. Guests stared as paramedics wheeled Margaret Hawthorne through the room. Wrapped in blankets, pale, exhausted, unmistakably real. A sharp gasp rippled through the crowd. Phones came out. Whispers exploded. Ethan Hawthorne stood frozen near the center of the room, his glass slipping from his hand and shattering against the marble floor. Vanessa Cole took a step back, her face draining of color. Margaret's eyes opened slightly as the bright lights overwhelmed her. Her gaze swept the room, taking in the faces, the chandeliers, the celebration she had been erased from. Then her eyes landed on Ethan. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Margaret said nothing. She didn't need to. The truth was written clearly across her face. Ethan looked away first. Police officers stepped forward, blocking his path as he instinctively moved toward the stretcher. "Sir," one of them said firmly, "please stay where you are." "What is this?" Ethan demanded, his voice sharp with forced authority. "There's been a mistake." "There hasn't," the officer replied calmly. "We need you to remain here." The stretcher continued toward the exit, through stunned silence and staring eyes. Cameras recorded every second. The perfect image Ethan had built began collapsing in real time. Outside, ambulance doors were already open, lights flashing red and blue across the glass walls of the estate. As Margaret was loaded inside, the sirens wailed again. Louder now, final. Grace stood just inside the doorway, watching as the ambulance pulled away. Behind her, the party was over, and nothing inside the Hawthorne estate would ever be the same again. The Hawthorne estate did not return to silence after the ambulance left. If anything, the quiet that followed felt heavier, thick with tension, stripped of music and illusion. Guests were escorted out in uneasy clusters, their conversations hushed, eyes darting back toward the house as if expecting the walls themselves to speak. Police officers remained. They moved through the estate with calm authority, their presence transforming luxury into something procedural and exposed. The grand living hall, once filled with laughter and champagne, now echoed with measured footsteps and clipped instructions. Ethan Hawthorne sat rigidly near the edge of the room, shoulders tense, jaw locked. His suit, immaculate just an hour earlier, now looked stiff, almost costume-like. The confidence he had worn all night no longer fit. Officer Daniel Brooks stood across from him, posture steady, expression unreadable. "Mr. Hawthorne," Brooks said evenly, "we're going to ask you a few questions." Ethan forced a smile that never reached his eyes. "Of course," he replied. "This is all a misunderstanding." Brooks didn't respond. He gestured subtly, and another officer began documenting the scene. Downstairs, the basement was no longer forgotten. Photographs were taken from every angle: the bare concrete floor, the flickering bulb, the metal door with its external lock. An officer tested the handle from the inside. Nothing. "No interior release," he noted. Another officer recorded the temperature. Cold. Unforgiving. Everything was documented. Grace Miller stood nearby, arms wrapped tightly around herself. The adrenaline that had carried her through the discovery was fading, replaced by exhaustion and a quiet tremor that wouldn't stop. She answered questions carefully, describing exactly what she had heard, what she had done, what she had seen. She did not embellish. She didn't need to. Upstairs, a technical team accessed the estate's security room. Screens glowed in the dim space, displaying camera feeds from hallways, entrances, and stairwells. They rewound the footage. The room fell silent. On screen, Ethan Hawthorne appeared guiding his mother down a back hallway. His hand gripped her arm firmly. Margaret resisted slightly, her other hand raised in protest. The camera followed as Ethan opened the basement door. Margaret stumbled forward. The door closed behind her. The lock turned. No audio was needed. The timestamp confirmed everything. Officer Brooks exhaled slowly. "Preserve this," he instructed. "All of it." Back in the living hall, Brooks returned to Ethan. "Sir," he said, "the evidence doesn't support your explanation." Ethan's composure cracked. "She was confused," he snapped. "Emotional. I needed to keep her calm. This was for her own good." Brooks held his gaze. "Locking someone in a basement isn't care." Ethan looked around as if searching for allies. He found none. Vanessa Cole stood near the far wall, arms crossed tightly, her red dress suddenly out of place. When an officer approached her, she flinched. "I didn't know," she said quickly. "I thought she was resting upstairs." Her words were noted. Her phone was taken for review. Outside the estate gates, flashing lights attracted attention. News vans arrived one by one, cameras pointed toward the property. Reporters spoke urgently into microphones, speculation spreading faster than facts. Inside, the decision was made. Officer Brooks returned to Ethan with two officers at his side. "Mr. Hawthorne," Brooks said calmly, "based on the evidence and witness statements, you are being placed under arrest for unlawful confinement of an elderly person." Ethan stood abruptly. "You can't be serious." The click of handcuffs answered him. The sound echoed sharply through the room. Cameras captured everything through the glass walls. The billionaire, restrained, his authority stripped away in front of his own guests. Vanessa turned away, face pale, avoiding every lens. As Ethan was escorted out, the illusion shattered completely. The estate that once symbolized power now stood exposed, its grandeur unable to hide the truth. At the hospital, the world was quieter. Margaret Hawthorne lay in a private room, wrapped in clean blankets, monitors beeping softly beside her. The harsh cold of the basement had been replaced by steady warmth and controlled light. Doctors spoke in calm tones. Hypothermia, dehydration, stress. Nothing irreversible, caught in time. Margaret listened without speaking. Her body felt heavy, drained, but something inside her had settled. She was no longer trapped, no longer silenced. Later that night, Grace was allowed to visit. She hesitated at the doorway, suddenly unsure. Margaret turned her head slowly and saw her. A faint smile touched her lips. "Come in," Margaret said softly. Grace stepped forward, tears filling her eyes. She reached out, and Margaret took her hand, squeezing gently. "You saved me," Margaret said. Grace shook her head. "I just did what anyone should." Margaret's grip tightened slightly. Not everyone would have. Outside the room, the world buzzed with headlines and outrage. Investigations began. Statements were drafted. Lawyers assembled. But inside, for the first time in hours, there was peace. Margaret closed her eyes, breathing steadily, knowing that the darkness she had been hidden in no longer held power. The truth was out, and it wasn't going back. The days after Ethan Hawthorne's arrest unfolded with relentless momentum. What had begun as a private emergency call became a national story within hours. News footage of police escorting the billionaire from his own estate looped endlessly across television screens. Headlines no longer spoke of innovation or success. They spoke of elder abuse, false imprisonment, and the quiet cruelty hidden behind wealth. Ethan was transferred to a secure detention facility that same night. Gone were the tailored suits and practiced smiles. In interrogation rooms lit by harsh fluorescence, he repeated the same defense again and again, that his mother had been confused, that he was protecting her, that the situation had been exaggerated. Investigators listened without interruption. Then they played the footage. The hallway, the grip on her arm, the basement door, the lock turning. Ethan said nothing after that. Medical reports strengthened the case. Doctors documented Margaret Hawthorne's condition upon arrival: hypothermia, dehydration, elevated blood pressure caused by prolonged stress. Specialists confirmed that extended confinement in a cold, isolated space posed serious, potentially fatal risks for someone her age. Prosecutors moved quickly. Charges were filed for unlawful confinement, elder abuse, and reckless endangerment. Bail was denied. The wealth that once insulated Ethan from consequences now meant nothing against recorded evidence and sworn testimony. Vanessa Cole was questioned extensively. Though not charged, her name followed the story everywhere. Former partners distanced themselves. Invitations disappeared. Silence replaced confidence. The Hawthorne empire began to fracture. Board members convened emergency meetings. Assets were frozen pending investigation. Investors withdrew. Companies issued statements condemning Ethan's actions and severing ties. Power evaporated faster than it had ever been built. Grace Miller's life changed in quieter but profound ways. Law enforcement ensured her protection, recognizing the risk that came with standing up to someone like Ethan Hawthorne. She gave formal statements multiple times, her account consistent, unwavering. She never dramatized her role. She simply told the truth. Public response, however, did not overlook her courage. Messages poured in: support, gratitude, respect. Articles referred to her as the woman who refused to look away. Grace didn't seek the attention. She focused only on one thing: Margaret. At the hospital, recovery was slow but steady. Margaret spent days under observation, her body regaining strength one measured step at a time. Nurses kept the room quiet, shielding her from the chaos outside. She slept deeply, uninterrupted by fear for the first time since the night of the party. When she woke, she remembered everything. The basement, the lock, the betrayal. But she also remembered the door opening. Grace. One afternoon, sunlight streamed through the hospital window as Margaret sat upright, wrapped in a soft blanket. The city moved outside, indifferent but alive. She watched people walk the sidewalks below, each of them free. A doctor confirmed what she already felt. She was stable, safe, no permanent damage. The words settled gently. Grace visited again that evening. This time, Margaret reached for her hand first. "I built my life believing strength meant control," Margaret said quietly. "I was wrong. Strength is what you did." Grace shook her head, overwhelmed. "You shouldn't have been alone." "I wasn't," Margaret replied. "Not in the end." Legal proceedings continued without pause. Court dates were set. Evidence was submitted. Experts testified. Ethan's legal team tried to argue intent, misjudgment, stress. The court focused on facts. Margaret gave a statement. Not in anger, not in revenge, but with calm clarity. She described the moment her son chose image over humanity. She described the silence, the cold, the waiting. The courtroom listened. There were no gasps, no spectacle, only truth. Ethan Hawthorne was formally charged and held to stand trial. The empire he built remained under scrutiny, its future uncertain. But Margaret no longer measured her life by his shadow. When she was finally discharged, she chose not to return to the estate. The Hawthorne house stood empty now, watched by cameras and curiosity, its walls no longer hiding anything. Margaret moved into a smaller residence overlooking the coast. Quiet, warm, unremarkable in the best way. Grace visited once more before returning to her own life. They sat together by the window, ocean light filling the room. "I don't know what comes next," Grace admitted. Margaret smiled gently. "You already did the hardest part." As evening fell, Margaret stood alone on the balcony, one hand resting against the rail, breathing in the salt air. The world felt different now, not safer, not perfect, but honest. She had been silenced. She had been hidden. But she had not disappeared. Below her, waves rolled endlessly toward shore, each one breaking, retreating, returning again. Margaret closed her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she thought she had lost. Freedom. What began as a perfect celebration ended with a truth that could no longer be buried. Behind the wealth, the smiles, and the power, one silent act exposed a cruelty no one expected, and a man who thought he was untouchable. This story isn't just about money or status. It's about what happens when control replaces conscience. If this story shook you, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments. Do you think power makes people cruel, or does it reveal who they truly are?